Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today, we're going to be looking at Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson. And today, we're going to be talking about how or becoming like gods, how to become like gods. So I'm really looking forward to it. Take it away, Roger, Claire, and Victor.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. All right, let me just go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so welcome and thank you everyone for joining us. Today we're going to be covering the Maps of Meaning lecture for TVO number 3, Becoming Like Gods, which is a pretty ambitious title. But we're going to kind of break that down as to what it is that means. But to get us started, first and foremost, we're going to be talking about what it is that we're going to be doing today. So first thing to start with, I'm going to ask everyone to empty the meaning of the word God. I would like, mostly because we are a very diverse group and we all have very different definitions of what that word means and what that word signifies. And I would like for everyone just to mentally and actively take a moment to empty that word from its normal meaning and humor this idea and kind of suspend disbelief for the moment to try to kind of understand what Peterson is really trying to get to here. And a couple of other frameworks that I'm kind of setting up so that we can maybe understand things a little bit better is one, the toolbox, which essentially is just going to be concepts that we've already talked about or discussed before that we'll be using today. And then 2 would just be the goals. So for toolbox, or things that you should keep in mind from previous talks, is the 2 forms of truth from the first lecture, which essentially just means that there's affective truth and empirical truth, or the objective and the more subjective aspect, but the value that both have. And then the second thing that I would like everyone to keep in mind is the presupposition of myths as a form of truth. In other words, that myths don't function necessarily as a retelling of a physical events or reality itself, but rather how reality is experienced and what it is that humans experience when they're living, especially effectively, or what it is that is currently happening to all of us, right? And finally, the last one that I would like everyone to also keep in mind is the chaos and order lens. And what I mean by that is simply understanding and knowing the concept of order and chaos, knowing that it oftentimes is used symbolically. And essentially, if you have missed that one, order is known and predictable, chaos, unknown, unpredictable. Now, real quick, for goals or things we'll be trying to cover today. One is the God lens. So the idea is we're trying to wrap our head around what archaic people meant when they talked about gods and how understanding that changes the meaning of a lot of myths once you wrap your head around what it was they were actually trying to get at. This is why I'm kind of asking everyone to empty that word. The second one is defining stimulus, understanding why that word actually still is relevant and why and how it directly connects to how people used to see gods. And then with the help of Victor, we'll be diving into the Egyptian myth and some of its details, as well as the idea of sovereignty and what the Egyptian myth has to say about sovereignty and what should be sovereign, as well as what the Egyptian myth has to say about divinity and the implications of that divinity. So hopefully the word God and gods is empty, and now we can get started. So to start, now that you have this empty word, we should fill it right back up. So the way I'm going to approach this is essentially we're going to build this idea from scratch. And the first way to do that is essentially, what was it that archaic people meant when they said gods? And more importantly, why was it that they believed in it? And by archaic people, for those who don't know, it's essentially just before the separation, the idea of science, which is the separation of the affect and the object. So we can define gods essentially as by what they have in common. And what they seem to always have in common is they seem to be beings that have control over us and the reality around us, right? Most gods, I mean, you don't really want to hear a story about a god that has no powers. That's just a guy, right? So a god needs to be able to manipulate you or reality around you. They never really die. And yet they seem to be very similar to us, but they're also never the same as us. So they seem to, if not be immortal, at least be transhuman or beyond us. They seem to be forces of the cosmos. So the next question, and a question that might help us understand what it was that they meant by gods, was why did people live and die worshiping these things or this concept? Perhaps if we can understand that, we can understand what it was that they were even doing. But to understand that, we need to go into why did gods have power in the first place? Why was religion so common and then up until very recently is starting to decline? So the main question becomes, is it just a story that's outdated, as we've talked in the first one? Is it just that we woke up and we realized that these myths were actually not real accounts and therefore should be dismissed? Or was there something more? And to elucidate this point, Peterson uses the god Venus, the god of love, the Greek god. And he points out a couple qualities about her. He says, well, what she represents is transpersonal. It's not limited to one person. If you kill someone who's in love, you haven't killed love, right? Love is actually quite not that affected if someone dies. It has a force of a personality. In other words, it'll make you act a certain way. And especially when you first feel it, you're not used to it. Many people have seen, the puppy love that's very common among young people, where they become enamored with someone and they become a completely different person. Or we've all had that friend that finds a new girlfriend or boyfriend and completely change who and how they acted. So there seems to be this connection with both love and gods, and Venus, the god. It also changes your perception of how you see things. Not to be mean or shady, but you can see this even in relationships where someone, believes someone is extremely attractive, and from your own subjective opinion, you're like, if you say so, right? Like it's a very subjective but transforming process. And more importantly, they can do this so much so that it can actually undermine your will. By your, I mean the conscious you, right? But it can make you do things that you wouldn't do, that you would tell yourself you wouldn't do. Many people, especially young people, will say, I would never get married, or I will never do X, and then find themselves in situations where that is exactly what they're doing. When you're possessed, by her, you don't really seem to have full control. And then Peterson brings up another example, which is the example of Mars, the Roman god of war. And he kind of asks, well, what would that god even do? What would be the use of that god? Well, in wartime, it would be quite useful to have your men be possessed or embody an ideal god of war. And it's to exhibit the behavior that would be appropriate for a war zone, for warfare. And before we move on, it's here that's really important to remember that archaic people, which are the people we're talking about, really struggle to separate motivational affect from the object itself, right? And what Peterson makes the case is that what gods actually are more than just projected more motivational forces. They didn't just externalize those and then, call them gods, but what they were doing was they were attempting to explain an idea about human psychology that to this day we still have, right? They're trying to explain the exact same thing as a concept that in modern days is very common, and that's the stimulus. And before I move on, Claire, do you have any thoughts on the gods?
I think it's really important here that Peterson uses both Venus and Mars as these two examples. And it's because I think both of these sort of possessions or emotions, if we want to call them that, are so forceful. And I think that quality of love or infatuation or even sexual drive being the first one. And as you said, Roger, of, we have our goals, we have our life, we're sort of headed towards somewhere. And then bam, you get hit with this sort of otherworldly feeling that is love. And everything goes out the window, right? The plan, it's just so out of our control. And I think and the only other kind of thing that I think is so similar is that those feelings of rage and of anger. And, we can have that, any strong ethical and moral compass, but then boom, when something really strikes us the wrong way, we are overcome with this feeling of rage. And I think, that's something even I'm grappling with is, hey, how can I control those emotions? And I know now psychologically that those are things that are going on in my brain. I know that those are things that I can have tools to combat. But I think it was so interesting. And this was the first time in this video that I really was exposed to this, of thinking about what that would feel like to be kind of in the archaic world, and to be living and to be sort of shot by Cupid's arrow, and to think, okay, that's Venus possessing me. Like, logically, that did make so much sense to me, because that really is what it feels like, is that this god is somehow possessing you or shooting you, or kind of has gripped you by some sort of an otherworldly forces. So I think that those two are really significant examples, because they're some of the two most sort of forceful possessions. And I love that he uses that word possession, because it is like you're really possessed by something.
Yeah, and also just to jump off your point, it's also what Freud identified as the two drives that are most hard to integrate into society, right? Our need for sex and our love for violence. It's like those are two things that are most hard to push down into a social setting. So as we were saying with the stimulus, let's go ahead and jump into what it is that a stimulus is from a modern perspective. And we'll actually find something quite interesting here. Because as Peterson points out, behaviorists who tend to not really be very interested in actually looking inside the head, mostly because they pride themselves in being empiricists and, scientists, try to then explain behavior that comes out, but also anything that goes in that then elicits a behavior. And for the behaviorists, they kind of attributed motivational force to an object. So things, when presented to certain people, will elicit a certain reaction. And Peterson points something very interesting here out. He says, well, the presumption that the mode of power resides in the stimulus is an archaic mode of thought. It's thinking the exact same way as the ancients did. It's the affect, in other words, how it makes you feel, of an object and the object themselves are intertwined. The way something makes you feel and the thing that made you feel that way are still connected, even to this day, in a place that prides itself in being scientific. And it's a good example that he gives is whenever someone says, he made me angry. Although it cracks me up that he says a child does, because I still say that. But it's that idea of like, no, it is you that made me angry. And what you did is what caused it. I had no play in this. It was you and your actions that did it, in the same way that it's the stimuli. It's the stimulus. It's the thing that happened externally that is what's defining internal. And another common one is beauty or attraction, as Claire said. When you are enamored, when you are in love, it takes over you. And when it does take over you, it's natural to presume that it is them that made you feel that way, right? It is because of their beauty. It's because of the thing that they themselves contain. Although scientifically we know that may not be the case, right? It may be your own biases, your own preferences, and all these other things that are in play. But from your own personal perspective, that's not how it's experienced. What you experience is actually the exact opposite. It seems as all these things are connected. And that's actually why I really like this meme, although it flips it. But I'm not sure if attractive or mere exposure. I think this is something that's actually quite common. One of the biggest indicators of who your life partner will be is distance. In other words, how close you actually are to the person. In other words, the more you see someone, the more there's a chance that you'll find them attractive, right? This is a common thing that arises in a lot of different situations. But falling in love, for example, is a reaction to a stimuli that produces a massive change in behavior, priorities, and personality. One could say they've become something different, or in mythic terms, possessed, right? It's the exact same phenomenon, just explained with two different terms. So if we do have these gods, the next question then happens, well, where did they go? Why don't we believe in these anymore? And Peterson quotes Jung here when he states, I asked the questions like, where do gods go when they die? And quoting Jung, he states, archaic man looks out into the cosmos and projects its own psyche onto it. What happens when they can no longer inhabit the external world? Do they stop existing? No. They return to the inside of the psyche, where they have always been. In other words, as archaic man looks out, the best and most natural explanation is to attribute it to other personality-like, human-like forces that are functioning similar to them, but not exactly what it is that they want to do. Now, this may sound very silly or kind of ridiculous, but I'm going to try to make the case as to why you should give a lot more credence to this idea than you may initially think. So what happens when the world stops being populated by gods? What happens when we stop having that style of understanding? Well, the part that made us believe in them is still in play, right? The very affect that made us buy into this idea of gods, we still feel. And then they just become psychological motivational forces. So if gods are externalized motivational forces that have been given the status of deities and are representatives of the ideal behavior profile that should be exhibited under different circumstances, for example, as we mentioned Mars, you would like a soldier to be able to be in a fit of rage, then a possible question you could ask is, well, then were the Greeks right? And do you have anything you want to jump in on, Claire?
Yeah, Peterson, refers to these kind of archaic forces or these gods as that they configure our world in a way that's beyond our consciousness. And in this way, they sort of produce these alterations in our worldview at a massive level, but that are so massively below our consciousness. And it was a problem then, but it is just as much a problem now that we're blind to these things. He uses kind of olfactory sensation as a really prime example of this. Olfactory sensation, our sense of smell, is hugely archaic. It goes way back in our evolutionary systems, and it's constantly influencing the way we interact with others. My favorite example is that like strippers make twice as much money when they're ovulating than when they're not. Or there's the t-shirt example about symmetry, but these are systems that are like constantly altering our worldview and the way we're interacting with each other, and yet we're blind to it. We blame it on some other kind of more external force. Someone being mean, to your example.
Right. And sorry, I also realized I didn't explain what I meant by if the Greeks were right, because Peterson has noted before that the Greeks believed that we are the playthings of the gods. Mm. So then the next question then becomes, could that be true? Both, gods in the sense that as humans, it's a human attempt to understand their experience. Well, if that were the case, what gods would we be the playthings of? And Peterson kind of points out that there's several fundamental gods of existence. Some may call them instincts, but for this exercise, we'll be calling them gods of existence, essentially. And he identifies at least two, though it's not exhaustive. But he says, and ironically, they're the two things that we were kind of me and Claire were already talking about: to propagate, in other words, the drive for sex, and to maintain yourself, In other words, the drive for self-preservation, which aggression is a part of. These gods must be worshipped or the game ends, right? They're requirement of all of us to worship them. If you don't care about propagation, that's fine. But once you die, your line is over, and anyone who did propagate, their kin continues. If you don't care about self-maintenance, that's fine. You'll die pretty quickly, and then the rest of anyone who did choose to play that game will continue to play. So then Peterson goes even further and says, well, it's not just that we have these gods, it's that also these gods have sub-gods or minions, people that are entities that seem to serve that god, but then have their own completely separate personality. And he points out that the god of maintenance, for example, is served by the god of hunger, the god of thirst, the god of temperature regulation. And the god of propagation is served by, for example, attraction or trust. And the motive forces that configure the motive forces that configure how you see the world and these instinctual forces are beyond your consciousness. They're not in your control, again, right? So you are their minions in a way. And here's where Peterson kind of starts to note some of the more instinctual subconscious influences that these gods, as we're defining them today, work on you. Peterson notes that mice often won't mate with other mice that they detect genetic similarities to a certain point. If they're too close to a certain similarity, they won't like it. I think this has also been shown in humans that, like, if people are related, they'll smell and they'll be like, there's just something unappealing about the smell. And the next question then becomes, if this instincts or these gods, how is it that they attain control? How is it that they can control you then, if you are the playthings of these gods? Well, for anyone who's come here before, you may remember past talks, or anyone who's been reading Maps of Meaning, you may also remember that the world is too complicated to process everything. You have to filter things down to only what's relevant. But then, well, what defines what's relevant? Well, your aim. So whatever it is you're aiming at defines what world is presented to you, because no one can ever process everything. You know, your peripheral vision, there's a lot of things in it, but as long as nothing changes, you're not actually that aware to what's actually going on there. So one, by controlling your aim, but then if what you aim defines what you see, what you feel defines what you aim at. And your values are what define what you aim at. Now, then here's where the immortal gods are sneaky, and they start to work in mysterious ways, because then the idea then is, well, where do you get your values? And are they always the same? And here's where we get into the gods and their personalities, because different gods value different things and use different methods. For example, aggression, or the god of Mars, is not an appropriate behavior profile for seducing a mate, but it is a good one for a physical threat. And once they are the ones in charge, and when they are needed, they change your unconscious sentiments in a way that influences your perspective of what reality even is. So it's never really even a choice for you. You see what it is they want you to see because they define what it is that matters. Or at least in part. This by no means is just a deterministic fatal theory, but that when you are possessed, when they come out, they are defining. And attraction is a great example. There's an entire science of mate selection that we still have barely uncovered anything. Things such as birth control, ovulation, smell, symmetry of face, just to name a few, can affect your attraction completely below your conscious level, without any of your awareness, but has a direct influence into who you find attractive. One of my favorite ones is the wedding ring effect, which you can put a male and a female fish, and then another female fish, and then on the other side a single male fish, and the female will pay more attention to the male that already has a mate rather than the single male. And any person that's ever dated and posted it on Facebook can probably tell you that once you announce that you've been taken, that's suddenly when everyone wants to reach out and say hi, right? It's all these subconscious influences that are moving around that we aren't even aware of. But if ye of little faith are still skeptical of the strings that tug at us without us knowing, then perhaps an example of yanking when your view is deemed irrelevant by the gods might suffice. And here's where we get to the situation of what happens when gods demand control, where it's no longer a question and they don't need to play nice. Because sometimes our gods need us to do their bidding immediately. There is no time for sly manipulation. In this instance, there's little regard given to our opinions on the matter. The first example is being surprised. Whether we want to or not, when we experience surprise, we immediately pay attention. That's the orienting reflex that Peterson really likes, that we essentially constantly pay attention to any novelty or anomaly, anything we didn't expect, whether we want to or not. We also, especially if we perceive it as a threatening surprise, drop our head and raise our shoulders immediately. Anytime especially when you're scared, you'll drop your shoulders, bring your hands up. Why? Because essentially you're protecting the back of your neck. You're protecting one of your most vital parts and then your vital organs when you bring your hands in. But all this happens regardless of whether we want to or not. Another one that another example that Peterson's used that is horrifying to me is psychogenic polydipsia. Hopefully I said that right. But essentially what it means is extreme thirst that's unquenchable. This can happen for a lot of different reasons, but essentially it's an example of a god gone mad. It's an unquenchable thirst that can sometimes be experienced. For any poor mortal with this condition, if left alone, they'll drink themselves to death. Now, the important part here is, even if you tell them that they don't need water, right? No mere mortal can deny the will of the gods, especially one as high as thirst. So even if the person knows full well that they shouldn't be drinking water, they can't and won't help themselves. In the Wikipedia, one of the ways to treat it is you literally restrain the person, you hold them down. And it's because even if they know they shouldn't, there's no negotiating with thirst once it gets to that level. So again, who's in control in this situation? You or the god? The next one is fear response. The sensation of fear, as Peterson notes, is a preparatory behavior for an encounter with something that's unknown. What do you do to prepare when you don't know what to prepare for? Well, you prepare for everything. So all systems are activated and you're ready to respond at a moment's notice. When you're afraid, the gods of fight, flight, or freeze possess you. And you may be surprised which one actually possesses you. But again, your opinion's irrelevant to the mighty gods here. You may see yourself as a brave fighter, someone who would always stand up for justice or the right thing. But when the chips are down, that might not be the god that comes up. You might just run, or you might freeze, right? Your own conceptualization of who you think you are is irrelevant to what actually might play out. So again, who's in charge? And Peterson notes, very few mortals can maintain control of when gods demand it. And for me personally, I really identify with this part, especially with my experience in boxing, because I think the training of boxing only helps you in that specific situation, only helps you get rid of the fear of boxing. It doesn't just make you Superman and brave and able to handle anything else. But the sign of a novice fighter is someone who still gets scared in a fight. We all get nervous, but the true fear, the freezing, the stiffness, that's someone who still hasn't learned to not be afraid, hasn't acclimated to the setting of being in, mock combat. And then finally, the last one, which is stress. Like fear, it's your body preparing for everything by a generalized inhibition of emotion and motivation. Unlike fear, which deals with immediate and direct unknowns, stress is more long-term. It's its long-term equivalent. The god of self, here's a good example. the God of self-preservation doesn't care that that your stress about your eventual and unpredictable death is keeping you up at night and making you depressed. It sees a threat that it doesn't know how to prepare. So that it doesn't know how to prepare for. So then it must always be ready, which is ironic because that only improves your chances that you'll die earlier, as cortisol leads to heart disease and other illnesses. So as you can see, there is a good case to make for us not actually being as much in control as we would like to think. So as you can see, the gods are alive and well within us. They help and hurt us as they please. Though they should not just be thought of as a personal god, we are social animals, and after all, gods also have a say in our society. So to understand that part, we're going to jump to Victor, who's going to be presenting the Egyptian myth.
Give me a second, guys. I'm trying to share the options.
No problem. Oh, and actually, while you set up, Claire, sorry.
No, you're great. You hit nail on the head with that. I think I had an experience yesterday, just like an anecdote here. I was very scattered. I was really all over the place, kind of frantic, high energy, couldn't get all this together. And what I came to realize was that I'm going on like a little road trip this weekend and I hadn't planned it out. I didn't know where I was staying. I hadn't connected with my friend about it. I hadn't had that centered. And in listening to this video yesterday, I was so identified with that sensation of all the gods sort of shouting at me that I had all of these different, and that's so true of chaos, that because I hadn't sort of mapped out, there was this fear center to the future, my body wants to be maximally prepared for whatever could come. And so then it opens up all these gods. And it's just like this image, like Disney's Hercules, just kind of shouting with me. It could be this, it could be your career, it could be your family, it could be all these different factors. And it was only through sort of like sitting down and coursing it out that you start to silence those different gods. So I'm just loving the sort of personification of these emotions.
All right. So moving on to the mythological stories. Last session we discussed a particular story, and it was from Mesopotamian and Sumerian culture. Let's do a quick recap, which will help us to dive into the new story. So last time we discussed Tiamat, Apsu, and Marduk story. Basically, it goes from a particular order to a chaos, and then to a new order. So what we had was Tiamat, who represents all potential, faces Apsu, faces Tiamat, and in turn they produce elder gods. So now these elder gods, they get rambunctious and they kill Apsu. Now Tiamat gets angry with this situation and she wages a war on elder gods. Then we get introduced to Marduk. Marduk is the youngest god who has his special abilities. He can see everything. When he speaks, he has this fire-like thing that when he speaks it out. So he has these new features, and everyone decides that he is the only one who can go face Tiamat, and so they nominate Marduk to go ahead. So Marduk asks only one thing, that he wants to take control. He takes control, he goes ahead, battles with Tiamat, and he brings in the new order. So this is the story. So now we know what happens here. Now let's dive into the new story. And this is from Egyptian culture. So historically, Sumerian culture and Mesopotamian culture and Egyptian culture came after Sumerian and Mesopotamian cultures. So cultures are evolving, and so the myths are evolving over time. So in this story, one thing to point out is this story came into existence at the dawn of the culture. not during the evolution of the culture. And this particular story involves four main characters. The first one is Osiris, the king of the state Egypt, Isis, queen of the state, Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, and Seth. Seth is evil brother of Osiris, Osiris the king. Now, the story takes place in this kingdom, and it revolves around the idea of who takes control of the kingdom. Now, Osiris, the myth goes like this. He actually formed the state, and he is highly achieved person, and he is in his old days. He's kind of senile, he's kind of ignorant at this point, and his thinking is still archaic, and he hasn't adapted to the new things yet, and he's kind of ignoring the new changes that are happening in the kingdom. And Seth, his basic motivation is to take over the kingdom, undeserved dominion on the kingdom. And what Seth does is he goes ahead and he chops up Osiris and distributes across the kingdom. And there is one point to be made here, that is, why not just kill him? And the idea of killing, we as humans, we know what being dead is. We kind of have an idea of non-existence. But when in the realm of gods, you cannot just go and kill a god. As Roger was pointing out, it's a transpersonal thing, and it can never be, it cannot be dead. So coming back to the plot of the story, Seth chops up Osiris and distributes across the kingdom, and he becomes the king of the kingdom. Isis then finds out. So this is Osiris and his characters. So he's archaic, he's blind to the current times, and he ignores evil brother's intentions. And Seth comes over and he chops Osiris into pieces and distributes him across Egyptian state. And Isis finds out that the course of events, and she is not happy with this, and she goes in to the kingdom and she finds Osiris, and she finds Osiris' phallus and impregnates herself and gives birth to Horus. Horus is the son of Osiris and Isis, and Horus, now his objective is to get the kingdom back, because he's the rightful son. And he grows up and he goes back and fights Seth. He is the king at this point. So now he goes and fights Seth. During the battle, Seth actually tears off Horus's eye. The eye comes off, but still Horus gets his act together and fights back, and he gets his eye back. Now, the path is clear. Now, Horus can just go ahead and get his kingdom. But that's not what he does here. So this is where Egyptians made the idea much richer. What Horus does is he goes back into the underground, gives the eye to his father, and brings him back to life, and then goes in and brings the new order. So now this is the story. And when we compare Tiamat, Apsu, and Marduk's story to Osiris, Isis, and Horus' story, the circle goes like this: order to chaos to order. Even in the new story, order to chaos to order. Only that in this context, Osiris, who represents old culture, is brought back to life by his son Horus in a new form. So that's the new thing in the story. So that's it from you guys.
Perfect. And also, I just got to give you props for how good your slides always are. They're so impressive. All right, let me switch back. Sorry, guys, give me 1 second. All right, and then share. All right, are we back on me now?
Yes.
Perfect. So, as Victor has said, these are the main characters. Now, I would like to apply, in this instance, the order and chaos lens that we've talked about before. Now, here, this isn't going to fit directly one-to-one, and I think it's mostly because in this story, there is a little bit of a different separation in just the characters alone. So, Osiris is naturally the representative of order. He is the founder. I think Peterson says he's essentially like if you can imagine George Washington 500 years from now, how Americans would think of him. It's just like, oh man, that dude, yeah, he did a lot of great stuff back in the day. And to the point where he's essentially a god, right? He is the person that created the Egypt. But as Victor pointed out, he's old, kind of senile, blind, but still holds a lot of wisdom and holds a lot of tradition within him. Then you have Isis, the benevolent chaos. This is the mother goddess. She's powerful, one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon. She's the sister of Set and of Osiris. We can get into that later, but she's also the queen of the underworld. Then you have Horus, which is the hero, who has the head of a falcon. He's new, and one of the things that distincts him the most is his ability to pay attention. And then finally, we have Set, who, from a Jungian perspective, represents the shadow side of Osiris. He is the god of war, chaos, and storms. In other words, the corrupting evil side. However, when we get into the analysis of the myth, and if anyone can't read this little comic, which I thought was very hilarious, the bubble says, I thought I'd suggest an alternative. Kudos. And they've decided to resolve their fight through a video game rather than a fight. But there's a couple of questions that make this myth kind of interesting, and some of which Victor's already alluded to. The first is, well, why doesn't Set just kill Osiris? Like, why does he have to cut him up into pieces and leave for the possibility of a return? Well, gods, like a behavioral profile, can never really fully be destroyed. Similarly, how would you kill the god of love, evil, or war? Right? How would you destroy that? Well, you can't. You can only ever destroy something that's the embodiment of it, but never that thing itself. The most you can ever destroy is an instantiation of that profile or of that god. The next question, another that Peterson also notes is, well, why is it that Isis becomes pregnant? And also in such a weird way where she goes and finds, the phallus of a dead god and impregnates herself with it. In later stories or in other stories, she actually puts them together and then brings them back to life, which makes it a little bit more easier to take in. However, the symbolic aspect of it is still there. And it's essentially that when any system collapses, any order collapses, it collapses into its parts. Those parts still hold potential, right? If, for example, Facebook were to really, as they're trying to break it up right now, if it was truly to just fall apart, right, declare bankruptcy, yeah, sure, the entity of Facebook has collapsed, but all the people that make that thing up are just as talented and genius as they were while they were in Facebook. The things hasn't changed. It still contains plenty of potential. And in fact, when that potential is met with chaos, new things can arise. Well, that's exactly what Horus represents, right? The collapse of the old order mixes with chaos, and out of that chaos comes a new order, a new and improved order, right? An order that's adapted to the current environment because the previous order wasn't adapting to the current environment, which explains which leads to the next question. why the hell does he have a falcon head, right? Why do that? Well, falcons are one of the few animals that have better eyesight than humans. And he's the son of the old culture and of benevolent chaos. He brings with him the ability to see better than all others. And just like Marduk, who had eyes around all his head, he is a representation of attention, of the current events, and of adaptation. Unlike thinking, paying attention and being able to pick up relevant information or see relevant information is held as one of the highest things. This is also, I want to add a little anecdote, which I found really interesting while doing research for this, was the eye of Horus, which is a symbol, is actually very, very similar to the eye of Ra, who is the sun god, who is one of the founding gods, and is used to symbolize sacrifice, healing, restoration, and protection. And it's the tears of the eye of Horus that is what they believe to be where the first Egyptians came from. So in the symbol, you can actually see the tear that's drawn into, if anyone who's ever seen an Egyptian eye, there's like that line that comes here. It's the representation of a tear. So why does Horus give his eye to Osiris? Because, as Victor covered, in the fight, Horus loses an eye. And then once he wins the fight, reclaims it and travels to the underworld to give his eye to his father. And it is this ability to pay attention that is gifted from the son to the father that allows the father to be revitalized. And after Horus saves his father from the underworld, they return to the rightful rulers to rule together. So here is where you're going to start to see a lot of very Joseph Campbell aspects of this. The descent into the unknown, the rescuing of the father. And Peterson talks about this a lot, and I think it's essentially a system of how we attain information and what all of us, if you think of us first and foremost as evolutionary creatures, what our drives would be. Why are we all driven to go into the unknown and then come back, right? It's this idea of returning home or returning to the father. It's because when you go out into the unknown, you'll naturally encounter chaos, something you didn't know about before. More importantly, something your culture likely didn't know about before. Now, normally we think of culture in the nation sense, but culture just within your family. What trained you? Who taught you? Once you go outside and encounter something new, it's then, in most myths, the story that the hero returns and shares that knowledge, that boon, that wealth, whatever it is that's attained out there, with the rest of their troop. And you can see why this would also have an evolutionary advantage, right? If you teach a bunch of monkeys, it's like, hey, if you just keep going out there and keep exploring more and attaining more information and then come back and teach it to everyone else, everyone's going to be better for it. So I'm trying to set up a little bit of the evolutionary scaffolding that Peterson's going to jump into next week. So just kind of keeping that in mind for next week. However, now that we've kind of used that lens, or Claire, did you want to jump in?
No, I think you're framing it up perfectly for the next section. The political context is really fascinating.
Right. So as we've talked about this myth, what effect do these myths then have on the actual physical world? As we mentioned before, these gods seem to have a lot more control than we'd like to admit. And the first that Peterson points to is sovereignty, or at least the concept of sovereignty. Why was the pharaoh seen as the avatar of both Osiris and Horus, as well as the current and former pharaoh? And how does that all work? How would that even make sense? And Peterson himself, I think, if I remember correctly, says like, yeah, look, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it from a rational perspective. From a mythological perspective, you can kind of wrap your head around it, especially if you remember that lens of gods that we've been talking about. So remembering that lens, we discussed earlier that the myth can be seen as the idea that an ideal ruler is the avatar of two gods, right? So the person that should rule should be the avatar of both Osiris and Horus, similar to in Mesopotamia last week when we talked about the ruler being the embodiment of Marduk. But in addition, he also must be the previous pharaoh as well as the current one. Well, if he is both the previous pharaoh and the current pharaoh, he's then the embodiment of tradition, in other words, the person that came before him, and the entity which could see the current events. Now, this is obviously ideally, which, to make a good point here, you need an ideal before you can judge good or bad. If you don't have an ideal, then you can't say that anything's good or bad, because good or bad is basically how close are you to what you should be, but that should requires a perfect. So the myths are an attempt to articulate a perfect, which obviously means they're gods. So then the next question becomes, well, then what is it that should have authority? And the myth makes the case that the personality that should have power is one that has the capacity to overcome corruption, which is Horus, and the wisdom of the past, which is Osiris. So this may seem all nice and well, and good for the Egyptians that they had that idea, but Peterson then kind of puts a pretty strong point on it by saying, well, look at their culture, look at the pyramids. They spent all their additional resources to make these things, right? At a time when resources were not easy to make, and this is like, we still, one, barely start to understand how they even made it, but two, could you imagine any country making this now? Could you imagine the amount of effort and work and money and everything that it would take? And it's literally a glorified tomb to some extent. So why did they do all this? Why spend so much effort to this? And to understand that, you have to understand that the pyramids were dedicated to the immortality of the pharaoh, who was possessed by Ka, which is the vital essence. But that vital essence was the immortal spirit of the pharaoh when it was as represented by both the connection of Horus and Osiris. So Peterson also brings up the Mat, which is that when the pharaoh did identify with the union and was both Horus and Osiris, this gave him the special ability of Mat. And Mat was truth and order. Mat refers to the ancient concept that of truth, balance, order, harmony, law, morality, justice. And at this point, we start to get quite close to Peterson's favorite thing, the logos, right? This is quite essentially the same, a similar concept. And if you're able to, and the idea here is that if the pharaoh is able to embody both Horus and Osiris, his conscience will allow him to see a true path forward where truth and order rules. Mat was the ability to put order in the place of chaos, and they spent all the excess of their society glorifying that idea. And I was curious, so I kind of Googled what they had to do to make these pyramids, and this is from Google. The workforce is thought to have consisted of thousands of skilled tradesmen and paid laborers as opposed to slaves, and estimates suggest that the project took about 2 decades to complete, which also blew my mind that only took 2 decades, but still the amount of resources, especially that they were paid, which is even more surprising, but the amount of resources that were required to even create these things should show you just how important and valued it was, which should beg the question, why? And Peterson also notes another important concept that arises from this. But before we jumped in, did you want to jump in on anything with sovereignty?
Yeah, I think, what I knew of the pyramids was that these were tombs, right? That they're meant to signify the death of this individual, right? Or to say, and I think what this is really showing is it's quite the opposite, that these are showing that sort of immortality of that union between Osiris and Horus, and that is the immortality of the pharaoh, and that sort of will live on forever. This idea of kind of Egyptian sovereignty or individuality being reflected in that the pharaoh's ability to kind of, as you said, overcome evil in a political domain, which we've seen in a lot of the myths we'd already covered, from Jonah and the whale all the way up to the Garden of Eden last week, but then combining that with this sort of wisdom of the past, and those coming together and creating this sort of immortality. And then, of course, as you're going to get to, that bleeds through.
Right. So And so now moving, because sovereignty is one of these ideas, but another one, and one that Peterson's really interested in, and is really key for anyone who's interested in why he says he believes in God, or in the Logos at least, is divinity. And for this, Peterson talks about the democratization of Osiris. And essentially what this means is that when, earlier on, the myth originally had certain holy symbols that only the pharaoh could use. And they were completely restricted from anyone else because they were seen as kind of divine in a way. But then these symbols started to become more and more common among the aristocracy, among the people that had some power within the society. And in a way, meaning that they were starting to identify with the process that is necessary for the proper state to emerge. In other words, it's not just the pharaoh that needs to embody Osiris and Horus. It's also the people that are in charge. And then you start to see this idea that this quickly starts to spread. And these, for example, Peterson points out to the Greeks, that for the Greeks, they saw all men as all Greek males as citizens, as a part of the set. For the Jews, that every individual can establish a direct relationship with a form of the deity. And then the Christians kind of take it all the way home, and they say, no, all humans have the spark of divinity, no matter who. Murderers, traitors, all forms of sinners. And Peterson makes the case that it is through this chain that our democratic notion emerges of how states should work, but also of our own natural rights. So you see how sovereignty arises and how divinity of the individual arises. And Peterson here is making the case that our values run much deeper than the Enlightenment. They predate our religions, as they are as for him, he believes that they are an articulation of the equilibrated state. All right. And to kind of bring this all in, unless you'd like to, Claire.
It's just so good. I mean, just the way that he builds human history on top of each other in this sequential way in which we can understand something that we kind of take for granted being natural rights and trace it all the way back, and then see what we've sort of lost as we've gone through and what we've kind of weeded out. But I mean, I think that equilibrated state, he's going to take it all the way back to chimpanzees, all the way even back to lobsters who have had that hierarchy. But yeah, this is just one of those like chills Peterson moments that he pulls human history together.
Right. And so in conclusion, to kind of try to bring this all together if we can, is Peterson kind of asks us first to truly consider what would happen if people did, if all this was right, if all this hypothesis was right, if creativity and traditionalism was seen as an ideal leader, as the embodiment of those two was seen as an ideal leader. Peterson's point is that the ideal leader is at least social, if not biological, in nature. And what he believes is that you can imagine that the ideal leader should be sovereign is a representation of the optimal combination between creativity and traditionalism. If you believe that, and what we mean by that is that if that was always shown as respectful, and if that's what you admired, then you can imagine that eventually, if everyone saw this or believed that, then the success of someone becomes dependent on how close they align themselves to that, right? The success of our social hierarchies is predicated on the degree that you embody that actual union. And as we adapt to it, the more we adapt to it, the more it becomes part of our environment. Now, Peterson isn't saying that we evolved once we were already human, but rather the exact opposite. He's saying that maybe we've been evolving to this game way before we ever thought we were even aware of this game. Because what he points out is, look, our political beliefs are essentially based on our religious beliefs. Our religious beliefs are essentially based on our archaic beliefs. And then the next question becomes, well, what is it that are archaic beliefs are based on? What is that deep down basis that we're standing on? And there might not be any, is what the counterpoint might be. But if we want to take that point, there'll be consequences to taking that perspective, because as Peterson points out, the idea isn't that we have religion. And so to clarify Peterson's point, the idea isn't that we have this religion and because of these religions that we've created this idea of natural rights. It's reverse. It's the idea that natural rights has already been acted out in many ways, is eventually articulated by the smartest social animal that's attempting to understand its surroundings by projecting its internal processes onto the external world. And to make that case, he essentially points to other social animals. He says, look, we know that chimps engage in war. We know that chimps will oftentimes use violence, but we also know that they'll also do very pro-social behavior to mediate that. If someone, if a chimp troop has a coup and like the alpha is killed, the new alpha will go around and kind of, soothe and, pay a lot of attention to a lot of the females to kind of bring down the tension and maintain the structure that they've just taken over. And Peterson kind of points out that there is a drive both to climb as well as to keep the entire thing intact. He also brings the example of wolves, and that wolves won't kill insubordinate wolves. Well, the question then becomes, well, why? Why wouldn't you kill someone who just tried to essentially take all your power and everything that you care as a wolf? And the case is, well, because in some way, even though it can't be articulated, because wolves don't really have a complete language, there's this belief that, or at least a rule that they seem to be playing by, that no matter how far gone any being is, their existence may still contribute in some way. And it seems to be a social animal aspect. But Peterson says, if you dismiss that initial idea, well, then you dismiss the grounds on which the state rests. In other words, all our other beliefs that stay on that. So then here's where Peterson's idea of belief is important. So then he asks us to think, well, what is it that you actually then believe? You have to ask yourself, are you really willing to dismiss this idea that there's a biological ethic that arises that we all have, that you're better off to me alive than dead? Because if not, then if you're not willing to dismiss that, then you really have to start questioning what you believe, especially with regards to gods. And here's where Peterson's distinction between belief matters, because most people, when they say belief, simply think what I consciously think I think. Peterson says, yeah, we've already shown that you're not in control, man. We've already shown that your actions and how you actually act don't have anything to do with what you think you are. So why don't instead you look at how you're actually acting rather than how you would like or think you're acting to see what you actually believe? And his point is, because you act as though natural rights already exist. You act as that's already the rules of the game, even though no one's ever declared that those are the rules of the game. Well, I mean, some have, but philosophically way later. But these seem to have already been in play from a long time ago. And he says the point that, he says the point that essentially you have this choice. If you want to, you can disregard that and say, look, cool little hypothesis, all this isn't really connected. It's not true. These myths are just nice fairy tales we told ourselves. But then Peterson says, yeah, but then you lose the foundations of the natural rights. And if our entire belief system, our entire state, all our laws and everything else is standing on sand, we're going to be in trouble, because that's exactly the moral relativist perspective, right? It's like, this thing just came up out of nowhere and there wasn't any actual order to it. We just happened to decide that that's what's happening because of random cultural influences. So then again, what is it you actually believe? And that'll be it.
That was amazing. Thank you, Roger. All right, folks. So it's time for Q&A. We have 4 rules as always. Number 1, type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask questions. Number 2, stay on topic. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. And what we're going to do, the plan is we're going to do Q&A. Then we're going to go into breakout rooms, and then we'll come back with takeaways and concluding discussion. So it's going to be Cotton, Jairo, and Paul to start with. Cotton, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Roger. It was very thorough. I was interrupted a few times during your presentation, so lost a bit of the flow. So I'm trying to put it into perspective in line with, I think the title of this meetup is something like how to become more like God. So can you kind of tie it together if it's supposed to be?
Yeah. So the idea is becoming as gods, is the idea of what was it that gods actually represented, what, you know, in ancient times or in archaic times. And the idea here is that gods were internal projections to understand the external world. So essentially becoming as gods is that they were us. You know, the conceptualizations of gods were in many ways us, ourselves.
Next up is Jairo, followed by Paul. Jairo?
This was fascinating. Thank you very much, Roger and company. And is I or it's more like something to think about because I see it as these cultures and these religions are pretty much have been killed by perhaps killed by and replaced by Christianity. Like I'm thinking of Greek gods and goddesses and Egyptian gods and goddesses and all those characters. They were kind of wiped out by Christianity, and so there's something kind of lacking in our culture. Maybe guys like Thomas Campbell and Carl Jung and this newer guy that we're studying. And I'm thinking that that's why for the past maybe 150 to 50 years, Eastern religions have become more popular, not just in meditation, but in power of using deities as archetypes to empower us. Because there's an idea in tantric Buddhism called empowerment, where you take on the deity, you identify with a Buddha. They're also called deities, and that's supposed to give you a quality. Robert Priest that talks about tantric Buddhism in that way. In
Jairo, your sound is going in and out, but I think we've got gist of what you have to say. So let Roger and others respond.
Yeah, I would just say that was in Jung in Man in Search for Soul. That was kind of one of Jung's observation is that even when he's developing therapy, he says, oh, you know, the East already figured this out. They have this in yoga and meditation and like all these ways to deal with these contradictions that naturally come, whereas we're still trying to figure it out because we're of our adaptation of a very different perspective. He like, at least in my understanding of him, was that he actually saw the East as their religions as systems that were a little bit more encompassing, whereas he saw, for example, Christ and the redemption story as at least somewhat flawed in the sense of you can't say Jesus Christ dying redeems the entire world, and then the world seems to still be the same or horrible, right? It's not. It's the myth itself kind of starts to fall apart after that.
Okay, next up, Claire, Victor, if you want to jump in anytime, just unmute and I'll, and you can start speaking. So next up is going to be Paul, Joe, and Pegor. Paul.
Okay, all three of you, excellent, but Roger, you should go and speak in front of hundreds of people, honestly. You are better than excellent. Your understanding of Jordan Peterson is unbelievable. I don't have any, usually I have lots of complaints about many speakers which are on 52 livings or any other meetups. I cannot find anything to complain about, which is unbelievable, honestly. The
Don't
only
make me
thing
cry, Paul.
No, honestly, like I'm trying. I do understand quite well Jordan Peterson and quite well history. Like how you explained that to it, people should record it and listen to it again and again because you are explaining it perfectly. The only little thing I would add, and I think that you think about that too. If you replace Horus with capitalism and capitalism and continues with creative destruction, that's basically what it is when you think about it, which definitely comes to our lives and our in 2020 what we are experiencing, and a little bit more that transfer when you have the. We all know why they built the pyramids and what was their life and death and all that stuff. But when it was transferring to all nobilities in those days, and then to Greeks, that the power wasn't already in the Egypt. They started with Pharaoh, and then it went to the nobility, and then farther down. In the Greeks, that democratization, I know that it's more modern word, went to more people. Certainly, everybody knows that it was just males and not slaves and all that stuff. But that it's in us when you think about that. That with all societies, that it starts somewhere and it automatically continues. Then it takes 4,000 or 5,000 years later, in the beginning of Christianity. Or medieval Christianity, that from the Magna Carta, it came from the superior king, went to nobility, and then 400 or 500 years later, it came to all human beings. I mean, all males, certainly. Sorry, Claire, but that's how it was. That's a history, and just how you understand that. Please continue 100%, and thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm humbled.
Roger, could you explain the capitalism parallel? Because I was sort of lost on that.
Yeah, so for anyone who's curious as to why Jordan Peterson's not a big fan of communism, is he essentially sees the rise of capitalism and those concepts as quite similar to the process of how our general ethics arise. Is that like we're constantly trying to solve a problem, and out of those problems, a solution that's viable starts to appear. And what he sees communism as is as a purely rational attempt to create a system using only what should rationally happen, rather than a more evolutionary process where it naturally arises. And that's kind of his main point as to why. Because originally when he started Maps of Meaning, he was kind of curious, like, are these two just different ideologies, different ideas that two different sides own, and that's it? Or is it actually that a system arises naturally from itself, and it by no means is perfect or even solves all the solutions, but it's one that actually is solving a lot of different solutions all at once, and that's also why a lot of capitalists are big fans of the invisible hand. It's forces that honestly we can't even wrap our hands around, but that seem to, for the most part, work out, or at least work okay, right? That's their perspective. Whereas a communist perspective is much more planned out. We can account for things, and Peterson sees it to some extent as a Luciferian idea of like, we know enough to fix our own problems and to account for the entire system, and therefore we don't need unknown, or we can just plan everything out and plan for things. Whereas a capitalist would be like, no, you need to develop a market, and the market itself however the hell that works. No one can fully encapsulate the market, but the market will then tell us what it is, and the market gives us information that we can't otherwise attain. So that's kind of a generalized version of why Peterson sees a big difference between the two systems.
Excellent. Next up, and Paul, I second your evaluation, and I think Roger, today's presentation was particularly was way above everything. So it's excellent. Next up is going to be Joe, Pegor, Dave, Brian, and Jim and Giamparo. So Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to second what everybody else has just said. It really was an amazing presentation. So, and I very much appreciate it. And Paul, sometimes you kind of beat me to the punch. The idea of creative destruction and capitalism was my kind of question I was going to ask between that link. So I appreciate that. But the idea, there's another aspect of this that I thought about was he said it, I think at one point in the video, it was something along the lines of these stories become more coherent and they actually evolve, and they're like they over stretches of thousands of years. But I thought to myself, is that exactly true? You know, is it really more coherent than, say, what the Greek systems had? You know, and I don't necessarily see that as seeing it as, and if that's true, then what does that mean for the value systems? As far as, you know, the gods become the value system as opposed to the values becoming the gods. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that particular thing, because I didn't necessarily think that was exactly accurate, that religions have gotten more rational over the years.
Roger, your audio's.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so you have to remember that for Peterson, he's approaching it as a model of Piaget. So the idea is that, like, first there's action, and it's only till long after that that we actually understand what that action means. And even fully, we don't fully understand it. What it means is, first and foremost, you have to survive. You don't need to have it conscious. You just have to act correct. You don't, like, your understanding of what you're doing comes way later, right? But first and foremost, you need to actually act. And the idea is that for Peterson, he believes that essentially as we're evolving, we have a lot of conflicting, and we're actually going to talk about this next term. So like your question is going to be a perfect setup for it. But as we're evolving, we have all these different problems and all these different wants and all these conflicting things. And eventually a system, because of the evolutionary pressure that's put on us, a system arises that allows us to actually, that shuts down most of those problems. And that's what Peterson believes is the function of the hierarchy. And that's what we're going to be getting into next week. But the idea of the hierarchy, that's why Peterson is so in love with it, is that he believes that that is, at least in part, not just a social construct, because it was developed so early on that it actually became an evolutionary pressure that then shaped how we think of things and how we see things. And then those pressures are also what we then later project onto the world that then becomes the symbols of what we identify as myth. But the idea here is being like, why do now we give the rights to women, right? And that's why Peterson that's why a lot of people are like, oh, Peterson's trying to go back. And it's like, no, that's the exact opposite of him. For him, he thinks it's almost impossible for us to go back on any moral claim. I think and ironically, he's kind of similar to Chomsky in this, in that they both believe that there is more discovery of morality. And as we discover it, and we all kind of look at it and like, yeah, it's probably fair. We should probably, that's probably what we should be doing. We should probably respect women. We probably shouldn't have slaves. We probably shouldn't commit war crimes, right? It's kind of this articulation of an agreement, but first and foremost, the action must be acted out. God knows how long before we can actually articulate. And that's why Nietzsche, for example, believed that once we killed God, we would basically just be killing each other for a long time before eventually we would figure out a new system that would eventually arise from those actions, where some genius would articulate, this is the rule we should be using. And if we follow this rule or rules or, some form of system, all of us are actually satiated and we don't have to destroy each other, right? So like that, it's kind of this emergent idea of how we can all coexist, essentially, right?
Next up is Pegor, Dave, and Brian. Pegor, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to echo Paul and great presentation. Thank you, Roger, Claire, and Victor. It's more of a comment than a question regarding the point of Christianity. I think what Christianity did was unified or placed all these gods in a hierarchy via the angels and sometimes even the saints. And you can see this usually more in Orthodox, which is, I guess you can call it Eastern, than Catholicism or evangelicalism. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to give a little bit more context, if I'm not mistaken, I think Jung saw Jesus Christ as for gods, in the same way we're talking about gods, as the self, right? The thing that brings all other motivative forces behind it, and it connects into one singular force that drives with all the other forces also behind it. It's an embodiment of all of it into a monotheistic view of the motivational states. So this idea, but yeah, I think the reason we don't have this huge pantheon in the Christian religion is because it's kind of more seen that we already figured out the solution, right? It's not Mars and Venus and all these other people competing for our control, but rather if we can make a profile behavior of Jesus Christ, that's a viable option for all the problems that we'll face in life, right? That's kind of the what would Jesus do trope that Christianity plays.
Next up is Dave, Brian, and Jim. Dave?
Thanks, Shrikant, and Roger, Claire, and Victor. A great way to cover 5,000 years in a nice presentation. I was thinking about this a little different way. I'm going to throw it out for interest. I think we start forming a view of the world when we're small children, and we start interacting with gods, and the gods bring us food, and the gods teach us about the world. The gods protect us. The gods take us places. And the gods are our parents. And we start thinking, gee, if I could just be an adult, then I could do anything I want to do. I'd have all the power. And then we become teenagers and we rebel. But the interesting thing is we become adults and we have our own children. That's the curse. And then we will sacrifice anything for our children. So I just wonder, because ancient people had children, I just wonder how that came into being part of the formation of gods or that belief structure. But anyway, as I say, I think it's interesting to think about. But anyway, I'll just throw it out there. Thanks for everyone.
Oh yeah, it's a great question. So that idea, essentially you take that idea of we're all kids, everyone has to have children, and almost everyone that's born tends to normally have a mother and a father, at least just at some point. Everyone needs one. Doesn't mean that they'll actually be around for the uprising, but for the rising up of the child. You take that idea and extend it across time to the past, that every single person that's ever existed had to have a mother and father. And even before we were human, even before we were even close to human, and you start to make the case for Jung's archetypes, right? And also Peterson's archetypes, because Peterson identifies the great mother and the great father. And the idea is because those are the two things that you're guaranteed to at some point have in some way, right? At least just for the fact that you exist, there at some point had to be a mother and a father that met. So that representation is the idea of how not just this, it goes even beyond gods. It goes to the point of how we actually conceptualize gender roles, conceptualize the known and the unknown. And that's why he says that chaos is feminine, because chaos is a matrix. It gives birth to new things. It's the source of all these things. And why order tends to be masculine, because it tends to be represented as society and as a judge, similar to the classical gender roles that would have been embodied for a lot of human history.
Yeah, the one point I forgot is if we're a good Christian, we pray, "Our Father who art in heaven."
Right.
Next up is going to be Brian, Jim, and Japiero. Brian.
So yes, thank you all for all of the work you do on the presentation. It's really appreciated. It's obviously is essential for the discussion. I want to go off a bit on also what Dave and before that Paul said, and to think a little bit more about the context in which all of these gods have been highlighted. And I thought that this was about kind of tied together nicely, but towards the end of the presentation, at the beginning of the presentation, he talks, and I listened to the video too, the discussion is about Greek gods and feelings. So the Greeks came after the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, very roughly. And so chronologically, that's not quite right. But then again, at the end, it was, arranged properly in the democratization context. But then with the Egyptians and the Sumerians, the gods were more personifications of roles, or in the converse, the roles personify a god or embody a god. So there's no equivalence between gods and feelings. There's equivalence between gods and roles. And the context is important, I think, for each of these to tease out. One, for example, I think in war, the god of war, yes, is rage, that's a feeling, but it's also a certain context. It presupposes quite a bit if you're going to have a social context, if you're going to have a war, and not just rage, but also obedience, courage. So there's, again, I think the context is important. And I'd contrast that with Venus, maybe I'm not right about that, but Venus and love, which it seems like you don't need the same type of a built-up state to have the love emotion or a love goddess, as opposed to a war, which I think presupposes much more of a state. So again, these are just, I don't know if you agree or accept with any of that. I'd like to have your opinion about it. But I think it is useful it might be useful to tease out what some of these differences are in terms of chronology and context.
Yeah, great point. So taking them on one by one. So the first one is the chronology, which that's kind of not. It's not as relevant to Peterson's point, because his point isn't that they influence or even causally connected so much as there's an emergent property. There's an emergent ethic that we've already been carrying this whole time, right? So it's more a matter of like, we've already been playing this game, and these rules that are popping up are kind of socially being evolved, but they aren't necessarily completely dependent on, this happened, and then because of this happened, the next thing happens. It's more of different articulations of systems that work within this game that keep getting more and more efficient, essentially. So, for example, the emancipation of women tends to be more efficient for economies, but that, because you've just liberated half your workforce. But, so I think the chronological aspect, it's not as dependent, because I think that's that like sometimes, especially critics on the left, from what I've noticed, they misconstrue it as a causal connection, where because the Egyptians had the democratization of Osiris, therefore all other ideas follow, or because the Mesopotamians had this, all these other ideas followed. But instead, what he's trying to say is more of a Nietzschean approach, that it's almost like a discovery of the morals that we've always had, if that makes sense. It's a different claim than one that's like built on, when he says that it's built on the chain, it's the chain that's gotten us here, but there's no necessity that was the only path there, if that makes sense. And then for the second one, sorry, I'm trying to remember. Could you remind me real quick the other points?
Keep the context in mind.
Yes, yeah. So, right, yeah, the concepts, the context. Yeah, so that's why in the beginning I mentioned that rage and love, these are kind of feelings, but it's not just feelings and it's not just affect, but it's rather the personality profile to that affect. So like you said, with war, that rage will, could be a necessary one, but it's not the only one. As far as it assuming a state, that one I don't know if I would agree with, because I think DeWall's shown that chimps often do go to war, that troops, especially young troops that are adolescent, will patrol their known area, and any encounters with any animals that they do know, or even animals or that they don't know, or even ones that they do, they'll just tear them apart. So like the idea that there's a state required for war, that's the part where like I think war predates humans. This is kind of more my point, is that like there's actual tribal warfare even within high primates. So that would be, I guess, the only counterpoint to that. But no, I do think that context, and I do think Peterson kind of skims the top on a lot of these myths, because any myth or any pantheon just has so much detail that you could just go into it. But his point more is that there seems to be an arising ethic here, and we can trace that ethic back down to its biological source, which breaks down to how high order primates play a hierarchical game, essentially. And that in that game, there's rules that we may not understand, but that we do follow.
Thank you, Brian, for adding this additional texture. Appreciate that. And thanks, Roger. Next up is going to be Jim, Giaparo, Stefan, Kevin, Jeff, and Alden. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, that was a really good presentation. So excellent work to the team there. Now I feel like the conversation through the questions is changing just a tad, and I'm trying to like keep up a little bit. So I guess I'll just kind of throw something out there. I like what Dave was talking about with the narrative, and I would say you can apply it to the Bible. There's a timeline there, and there's also a timeline with a parent-child relationship type of thing, even in these individual locations, which those moralities are true at that particular time. That all kind of that genealogy that kind of begins to occur. As far as the personality profile, what I've found, and maybe this might be insightful too, is the Greeks were on either end of a dichotomy. And so, for example, Ares was both war, courage, and cowardice, right? The Greek gods, for some reason, went to the extremes, and they went to him very quickly. And Aphrodite, Venus, was love, the highest form of love, and lust, the lowest form of love. And I liked how you kind of worded that personality profile. And that's the weird things with the Greeks. I haven't quite found the one that I think it's the closest to a Jesus-like structure or something like that would be Athena. Athena's probably the closest, but that's what I found interesting in that Greek mythology, and watching the morality of the world and these different areas kind of bubble up. We see the democratization of the individual and individualizations extremely important. And that's why I think would go to Dave's point that the narrative matters. The overarching narrative from the beginning to the end. That's why you can't take the Bible on one verse. You have to take it on its whole. And that is the problem that a lot of people run into. So it was more of a statement. So sorry. It was really great, though.
Great point.
Right. Next up is Giaparo. Go ahead.
Roger, thank you. Would it be fair to say that by voluntarily embodying our values, that we become as the gods, or being God at the moment because we're embodying that, as opposed to just being possessed by any other force of the many forces out there?
Yeah, so that's kind of the Jungian take, right? That like, if we do have all these gods, from Jung's perspective, is like, well, what if you could make a game where all the gods are hierarchical, which is normally when you have a pantheon of gods, there tends to almost always be a hierarchy, right? Like there's the top god and then other gods that serve that purpose, but then have their own wants. And you're kind of trying to organize the inside of you. And that's what individuation, right, is that you're indivisible, that all your gods, right, gods here in this term, or all the different drives and motivational states that you have are all organized in a way where you can act as a single entity, but you've negotiated with all the different drives you have so that they all function in unison, right? And that for Jung, that's what he saw was the purpose of individuation, is that growing up, you have to hide parts of you. You have to put parts of you down just to even adapt and learn. But then once you've grown up as a full adult and you're independent, your job then is to go back in to see what's in your shadow, to pull out your anima or your animus, and to bring all those parts that you had to in some way either repress or push down and bring it all into one singular unity. And that was kind of the purpose psychologically of life, or at least that's how I've understood Jung.
I want to add, I want to just raise one issue. This guy, Julian Jaynes, makes a very interesting point about the differences in gods in Iliad versus Odyssey. The gods in Iliad are basically forces that you're just responding to, that are kind of working through you. You're kind of taken over by these forces. Whereas with very little self-consciousness or ability on your own to pay attention. But when you look at gods like the Horus, or when you look at Odysseus actually plan things, consider various things, there is this added faculty of paying attention. You yourself paying attention, which changes things dramatically, that comes into being. So it looks like there is like these two stages. One of these forces pushing you versus you then paying attention and kind of choreographing these forces at the point. What do you think?
That's a great point. And I think that actually points to Dave's point, right? That when you're born and you're a kid, you do have these gods. Although I would expand it to kind of mean in the way we mean, right? We're like, especially if you adapt the Freudian view, like your sexual interests take you and explore, like show you a world that's very different than the part of you that wants to be dominant. And it shows very different than the part of you that, you know, is just seeking food or just seeking exploration. And I think that as you develop, eventually it's possible, though many don't, to then learn how to control and negotiate and organize the internalized drives that you have, right? Like, but I think you necessarily don't start with control. Necessarily, you are the toy of your feelings first, and then eventually you have the capacity to master it. But it's a very difficult and hard thing that, to this day, I think most people don't do.
Excellent. Next up is Stefan, Kevin, Jeff, and Alden. Stefan, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you look at the gods as, I guess, symbolic of your mental states, then what do you think is the significance of the ancient Greek sacrificial rituals, such as slaughtering animals for the gods?
Yeah, so that would go to Peterson's ideas of sacrifice and that conceptualization of reality as a whole, right? So I think he mentions it that it's so if you remember in our previous lecture, that diagram that he drew where essentially you have your order and you're moving from one place to another, and then you have your second idea where it's like you have that, but then it collapses and you have a new one. And it's the idea that the more you're willing to sacrifice, the more you're actually able to gain. Now, from a religious standpoint, that's kind of just a leap of faith, right? The more you sacrifice, the more you gain. From a psychological standpoint, it's the more you sacrifice something that you value, when you destroy something that you value, you don't just destroy it, you create a vacuum. And that vacuum then gets filled by something else, which then completely changes your morality, your perspective, and your own values of what is important, right? If the most important, you can imagine what happens when you sacrifice something that's either very important or one of the most important things in your life. It's not like you just don't value anything, although you can, but normally you'll find something new to value, and that now dictates your behavior, because your behavior now is shaped to aim at that. And therefore, if you're moving closer to that goal, you positive reinforcement. If you're moving away or not moving at all, frustration, depression, all those things. So this idea of sacrificing tends to be kind of mythologized in religious terms, but then also you can just think of it as a purpose sacrifice for the creation of a vacuum that will allow you to adapt new values and a new purpose in life to some extent.
And that's also pre-mythology, as well as all of these things are in the way that squirrels, hide nuts for future. So that transition to understand that this which is valued now can actually do me better down the road, this kind of 2 cookies later idea, is really fundamental to that foundation.
Next up, so we're going to do 3 more questions, and then we're going to go to breakout rooms. It's going to be Kevin, Jeff, and Alden. Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you, Frank. My question is, I believe God, that God has own belief, which means related to religious culture and the others. Let's see also, God has a hierarchy. Should we learn from a top God, other God? Realities may different our beliefs. So it's also God is static or dynamic or perfect entity. It's like we should see the mirror, check ourselves, match the God we believe, or what? I'm not sure. I cannot form the right question.
Yeah.
So just pick up. Thank you.
No, yeah. So I think the way you're kind of asking is like, well, what is this concept of God, right? Is it perfect? Is it not perfect? Is it changing? Is it static? From my understanding of Peterson's perspective, I think what he would likely say is that it's our best attempt to articulate the best thing we can get to perfect of an articulation of what our ideal would be, what perfect being would be. Because essentially that's what we're trying to map out, right? Like we're trying to map out a perfect way of being that can then become the ideal, because we're trying to figure out how to act. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want to judge something by good or bad, you first need to have an ideal. You need to have something to compare it to. So being, if I tell you you're not being like Jesus, but Jesus is just a random guy and nobody sees him as an ideal, then it's irrelevant. But if I say, well, you're not being like Jesus, and Jesus is the best example of what a perfect being would be because he was literally the Son of God, then there's a good reason to be like him, and there's a good reason why there's the distinction between you and them, right? So I think from Peterson's perspective, it's our best attempt to articulate what it is we should do and how we should be.
Next up is Jeff.
So Roger and Claire and Victor, thank you so much for your homework and the quality of the presentation. I want to focus just on one small piece of this, which a little bit you just spoke to, and that is that it appears to me that this is a more of a dynamic and evolving consideration than something that is simply fixed in however we have, assigned the archetypes and the gods, as we've understood and told the myths and formed our beliefs about them in the past. And for example, it seems to me that the god of war possibly changes a little bit with the invention of nuclear weapons and the creation of, Geneva Convention. It seems to me that possibly, you know, how we conceive of the feminine changes a little bit in the last 100 years, you know, in Western civilization, with the changing role of women in society. And I recognize that those are not done just, you know, with the physical manifestations of those things have to do with character and their aspects. But I think that these things evolve a little bit. Even our conception of leadership, from being mostly positional to emerging to be somewhat situational. I think all those, if you will, archetypes evolve a little bit in accord with what you're saying, what you were just saying there with regard to our conception of the way we think we should be, or what it is that we're trying to produce. I'm not sure that's very well asked.
No, yeah.
What do you think about that?
So I think your central point is that it seems as though these ideals and these moralities are shifting across time. And I would say, yeah, because if you think of it from an evolutionary standpoint, what's going on? And what's essentially going on is we're building a bridge as we're running, or, you know, essentially to some extent, the environment is constantly changing. And then what we do in reaction to the current environment also manifests the next environment. So as you mentioned, all these adaptions, all these things eventually lead to the creation of a nuclear war or a nuclear weapon. Okay, well, that nuclear weapon, we need to evolve very quickly, which is from the start is Peterson's point. It's like, yo, we just created something that can destroy all of us. And most of our morality and most of the ways that we figured this stuff out took hundreds of years and lots of death. We can't do that anymore. We just hit a point where now the entire game can end if we mess this up. This isn't just, you know, a 10-year war that can happen in one location. This thing could spread and annihilate all of us. And that was Jung's concern too, is that we don't understand the psyche well enough to catch up to what science kind of unlocked accidentally. And so, yeah, I would say it is changing. So it's basically our environment's changing, and then so is our attempt to articulate the best way to deal with that environment, which is kind of the only way you can conceptualize that is as a moral conceptualization. It's like, how is it that we should act? What's the correct way to act? So as the environment changes, yes, so do we. But it takes a lot of time.
I would just add one thing of the brilliance of these archetypes. Consider the idea of Horus and Osiris ruling Egypt together as the ideal. There is the continuity, and there is the element of change in as a pair, that both these are needed, you know, kind of the dependence on the past and learning everything from the past, at the same time having that wide open eye at what is going on now and adjusting to everything. So archetypes manage to capture this kind of dynamic, moving system with stability. So stability element as well as changing element together is captured in the these kind of archetypes, which make them amazingly powerful. Last question by Alden, and then we'll do breakout rooms. Alden.
Thank you. And again, amazing job for everyone. It's just been always a pleasure. So there's two pieces that I'm struggling with as we go into this. And one of them is just simply, we have gone on to embrace a world where we see things through as much as we can an objective reality. That's how we've been taught in school, how we grow up. You know, this is a rock, these are its characteristics. And so when Peterson talks about us not having learned the ability to categorize the world in an objective sense until, you know, the 1600s, let's say, it's so beyond me to even fathom what that life would have been like 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, back in the days of all of these religions that we're talking about when they were first crafted. So I don't even know how any of you get into the mindset of what that life was like. And so I have a hard time grasping what that could be like outside of something like looking at an ancient map and seeing that the unknown was simply, you know, here there be dragons, you know, and this general concept of we need to envision there's scary things out there. rather than quantifying it in some fashion. But I'm wondering if there's any way that you can help me understand what that life might have been like in some tangible fashion, because Peterson really kind of pushes that lack of ability to state things in an objective sense and look at life in that way was the norm for almost all of human existence, and we've lost that. And so just how do you envision what that reality was like?
I don't think we've lost it so much as we just don't identify it. And I think that's why the examples of like, he made me angry, or God, she turned me on, or all these where the responsibility of how you feel is externalized. And it's like, well, that's not how this works, right? And the idea of a stimulus is like you're shown something, and the behaviors kind of sneak this up, where it's like you're shown something and then you react because of the thing, not because of you. And so I would say the idea essentially of the best way that I wrap my head around it is essentially realizing all the times when, though I don't feel fully in control, it's very natural or easy for me to blame something outside of me as to how I feel. And that's why you see a lot of like the Buddhists that kind of conceptualize it as like, you choose how you interpret reality. You choose what's good and bad. You choose. It's all within your control. You have the ability to conceptualize or interpret reality how you would like. It is not reality's fault that you feel a certain way. It's your interpretation of that reality that is causing that, or you can go the completely opposite way, which is some behaviorists, or they're called situationalists or situationists, but essentially their idea of psychology is kind of a creepy one, but it essentially means that most humans are the human behavior is determined more by what situation they find themselves in than by anything unique to the human. So in other words, put anyone in that situation, and that's kind of like the prison experiments, the Zimbardo prison experiments, where it's like, no matter who you put in there, power corrupts, right? Or the Milgram experience, like, no matter who you put in there, a lot of us will just push that button and shock the shit out of some stranger because it's fun, right? And it's like, yeah, you can have all your past and all this other stuff, but at the end of the day, if we put you in that situation, you'll do the exact same thing everyone else did, or at least most of you will. There's a pattern there. So you can take both of those perspectives, but that idea that like, oh, well, like the external is what determines the internal is something that also lends itself to this idea of gods, right? Of like, oh, well, like it wasn't me. It's like, when you're like explaining to your wife why you cheated on her, it's like, look, it wasn't me. She was just gorgeous. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't stop myself. I didn't have control over that, right? So it's kind of trying to, and I do it like, yeah, it's very hard, but I also think it's just very looked down upon, especially now with this, the Shapiro, like facts don't care about your feelings and feelings are irrelevant. And a lot of the personal perspective is kind of, especially in this empirical age, has just been shunned or been told that it's not important. When, if you take the more Jungian Peterson perspective, it's like, it's the most important. It's way more important than the scientific perspective because it determines what it is that you should actually do. So yeah, I guess that's probably the best answer I can offer.
I want to add one thing. This is very interesting. I don't know who it was where I learned it from, but the ancient people that we talk about. Actually, it's actually more appropriate to think of them as them as being our children. Like that's how we started. Okay, and so you use this evo-devo approach, which is used in evolution. So if you want to understand what we were like, actually just look at children. What children are, because it's actually exactly the same kind of thing that is going on. This is again the same approach that Piaget takes, that you start doing things, and then slowly you figure out what is going on by imitating people. Then slowly you develop names for it to be able to name it. And then slowly you can actually think about possible ways of playing. And that is a progression. So just like children go through that, civilizations go through that. So we are looking, when you're looking at Egypt, we are looking at the past, we are looking at, our children basically, or what we were like as children. So folks, we are now going to do the breakout rooms for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and share our takeaways, starting the breakout rooms now. All right, folks, welcome back. All right, welcome back. Everybody's back. All right, so it's time for takeaways. I'm going to call on people. First, I'm going to call on people who have not spoken before. The question is, what are you walking away with? So I will start with Maritza, William, and George. Maritza?
Oops, sorry, forgot to unmute. I actually, Claire just kind of derailed me a second with a fantastic quandary or improvement question in our discussion group. And yes, the question of culture as a symbol of our own individual self and personality, and how we project that into our world or our sphere as it were. And is it a matter of, like, you don't want to throw away culture, obviously, and Peterson even tells us that sometimes the archaic is, you can't quite tell the difference between the archaic and what is new, because without the archaic, the new cannot be known to you. The chaos doesn't make itself shown. And so the takeaway that I'm looking at here, and will look forward to refining as we go forth together here, is the question of how or if I myself would be molding culture, or am I merely molding myself? And through that molding, I would end up molding culture.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marisa. Next up is William. Let's see, William, go ahead.
Yes, great presentation. My head is still spinning. I think my big takeaway from this meetup is from the video that we saw, that 27-minute video, is here's Peterson lecturing at Harvard, and there are hardly any students in the auditorium. The first two rows are empty. There look like maybe a dozen people in a corner. And there were many more people in this Jordan Peterson Zoom meetup, I think 50 some, than there were in the original class. So I think that says something. I think it says something about the excellence of the presentation and some other things, but I'm not sure what. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Next up is George, Viom, and David Miller. George?
I suppose the takeaway I would have is the invaluableness of approaching these type of stories from a connotative perspective.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that so people get what you're saying?
Well, the connotations, allusions, metaphor, poetry. I think there's much more value and clarity in that language than anything scientific or literal.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, George. Next up is Viom, David, and Wesley.
Yeah, I think thanks a lot, Roger, Claire, and Victor. I think some of these ideas I've been aware of, but getting them in a much more crystal way, and I think the way the presentation was done, it really kind of makes me again rethink on some of these ideas and gets back to where, kind of think about, with the hectic work and where we are going towards, right? It's a balance that we have to keep. And I think today, there's a whole bunch of discussions we are having with our balance about these two areas. So thanks a lot. And I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you. Next up is David Miller. David?
Well, the problem is, what are you going to do with people like me who reject wholeness, who reject perfection, who value inner turmoil? To us, it's a challenge that makes life worth living. End of
Wonderful.
question.
That's a great that's a great question. And what we'll do is that at the end, Roger, Claire, and Victor will have a chance to respond to whatever they want to respond to. Okay. Thank you, David. Next up is Wesley, Aaron, and Tom. Wesley.
So I'm kind of catching up in the book a little bit, and I wanted to share that I found a PDF copy of Maps of Meaning on ResearchGate a long time ago. So anyone who doesn't have the book, I'm not sure if it's still out there. I know that since he published his book, it may not still be out there for free. But if you can find it, it's cool because you can search for different things. But there was something on page 72 and 73 that really jumped out to me that seems to be kind of a recurring pattern. And so he says that each developmental stage, action, imitation, play, ritual, drama, narrative, myth, religion, philosophy, rationality, offers increasingly abstracted, generalized, and detailed representation of the behavioral wisdom. And I think that when he's talking about like wolves not tearing out the throat of the defeated wolf, we kind of impose like a narrative onto what's going on. But what's really happening is that there's just a behavioral pattern that's manifested. And that seems to be something that kind of comes up over and over and over again in Peterson's message. And I just thought that was super interesting to see him lay it out. And then on the following page on 73, there's actually a diagram that shows kind of like how all of these things are related. And so when I saw that, there were just a whole bunch of dots that sort of all connected in a snap when I saw that. So that was something really, really cool that I noticed this week.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wesley, and welcome. Next up is going to be Aaron, Tom, and Judith. Aaron?
Yeah, a wonderful presentation, guys. One of the questions that came up in my breakout room is, how could this be applied to my life? And I always think there's a lot of people that think on the concrete level. And I always see, especially like the story of Horace, you look at what a past generation or something that's going wrong in this world and how you yourself can eventually come to fix it. And that doesn't mean that you're, necessarily going out and marching and protesting immediately, but how you yourself as an individual can improve, how you can improve your family, after that, and so forth. And then I think through improving yourself, improving your family, and improving your community, then you're actually creating a new order. You're defeating Seth by basically correcting some of the mistakes of a previous generation or just the world in the past. And I think one thing that's really important is that in our culture today, we have this tendency to like vilify the past, be like Thomas Jefferson is evil, all of these people in the past are evil folk. And the goal is to correct their mistakes, but not vilify the past. Like forgive the past, fix it, make it better, but don't hang up and just hate it, because ultimately they're a part of our history, our collective history. And the idea is to constantly make this world better without destroying everything that came before us.
Thank you, Aaron. Next up is Tom, Raphael, and Julie. Tom? Okay, next up is Raphael. Okay, next up is Julie, Mike. Julie, go ahead.
Okay. I think that the world is evolving to find out maps of how the world works so that it can work for everyone personally and as a society. And I think that there's so much of what doesn't work is based on falsities that need to be moved out, like someone preaching on a truth, trying to impose their truth on someone else. Respect and letting someone have their own journey works a lot better. And as we evolve in this way, we will no longer blame each other. We will realize how powerful we are actually about in places where we are powerful. Not that we control other people, but we can be like Jesus and show that you can't hurt me and come from love. And I think that it's a journey about finding, for me, moving out of vagueness and finding my own personal truth so that I can stand on it with an open mind. And anyways, that's what I got from it. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Next up is John, Giampiero, and Alden.
Yeah, I just I just think that there's like a underworld to society, and it's vast and very deep, and also in some ways it's like incomprehensible. You know, like the closer you get to it, like the more you zoom out, the more it has things in common, but the less resolution there is. The more resolution you get into it, the less it applies universally. So there's a conundrum there, and that we can't really be too precise about it. And I think that's where poetry and myth and things come in. One of my favorite, I think this was a Peterson quote, but he sort of was, and this is, I forgot what lecture this is, but he was sort of saying something along the lines of like, the artists and the poets, they're the ones who discover truth first, right? Before it's put into words. Yeah, like they're the ones who are out in front of what's coming down the pipe for society before the scientists or before the politicians or the philosophers even get to it. They're the ones who are just starting to put things into words. And I think that sort of ties into what we're talking about here, which is mythology. Mythology is sort of along that line of taking the non-conceptual and making it conceptual and utilizable by a society.
Excellent. Thank you, John. That was great. Next up is Giampiero, Alden, David R, and Stephen. Giampiero, go ahead.
Okay, this is for Roger said this. Our values predate our religions. I love that, and I've been saying that in a bigger sentence, and you gave me the words to be able to articulate this next time I want to say it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Alden, Stephen, and David R. Alden?
The biggest takeaway for me tonight is definitely just the honor and luxury that we have to have this community. So while all the organizers, you guys are doing an amazing job and getting the details going, I'm really also appreciative, Shikhan, that you've created this, and for all of you that are here to enable these conversations, because just going into maps of meaning is one thing, but then we take it all into all these tangents, and for so many of us, it sets us afire, right? It gets our mind going, and we go to bed thinking about all these things, and it's invigorating and life-giving. And so just, I'm really grateful to be part of the community. So thank you to everyone that's here.
Thank you, Alden. Really appreciate that. Next up is going to be Stephen and David R. and Jim. Stephen.
So once again, what a great presentation, Claire and Roger and Victor. Really good stuff. And the thing I'm taking away is that I have this Joseph Campbell background, and here we're learning about the Babylonian myth or Sumerian myth and the Egyptian myth, and we're trying to relate this then to maps of meaning. From what Joseph Campbell pointed out was that all cultures have these same, synchronous elements in their mythology, and this goes back to even African tribes. And we Westerners think we're so elite in some ways, but what a wonderful world and what a beautiful thing consciousness is. And the one thing I hope we'll talk about more is the concept of sovereignty, because I think that's a very profound concept that Roger and Claire brought up tonight. And that's the essence of me being here, I think, of each of us individually, is just, who am I? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Next up is David R. Let's see who else. Let's start with David R.
So great job, Roger, Claire, and Victor. Really very thought-provoking provoking topic. And during our breakout session, it really started giving me something to think about, which is, as we just mentioned, Stephen just commented, is that repeating theme or repeating narrative that occurs. And if you look at these as stories that help at any particular individual time, bring society together. So as these stories change and adapt to the current, time that people live in, there's the cohesiveness that the stories bring for society. But at the same time, as the details change, you have the outliers, the ones that aren't incorporated into the new version of the story. And my takeaway from this is thinking, what happens to those outliers when they are not included, but are pushed out as because they felt as being in competition? So what have we lost over time as our narrative and our story has adapted and changed, and the outliers are no longer relevant or have been discarded?
Thank you, David. Next up is Jim, Brian Nelson, and Joe. Jim.
Yeah, great conversation again. Lots of great ideas. What I would leave with is something to the effect of this. We hear systems and systems of belief. I mean, everything is a system at some level, right? You can talk about a hierarchy and it's still a system. Okay. I am of the persuasion that you, when you understand the system or attempt to, and you rectify yourself to operate within that system, or like you rectify yourself to become an individual, you are able to, in some cases, become a prophet, right? Because now you can project that system forward, or you can create a new system, right? That is forever eternal, and that is immortality. That is either heaven or hell. Okay? Because if you fail, it's hell. If you succeed, it's heaven. So keep that in mind as we're struggling, because I'm of the persuasion you have to struggle in order to be perfect anyway. So as you struggle for that, continue to push yourself, your mind, and be excited about that. And I guarantee you there'll be a lot of great things that will come from that. It's pretty great. Thanks. This is first time in the group, so
wonderful.
Pretty awesome overall. Thank you for the experience.
Welcome. Thank you. Next up is Brian Nelson, Joe, and Dave. Brian? Brian, you need to unmute yourself.
I would just like to second the comment someone else made earlier. I think the connotation comment as opposed to denoting. This is such a great way, a great format for discussing a wide range of very important topics in a useful fashion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is Joe, Dave, and somebody else. Joe, go ahead.
So I think that one of the major takeaways that I'm going to walk away with is the example of capitalism, as far as the ability for structures to collapse into these subcomponents, and then then they can rebuild themselves. And the reason I think that that's so significant to me is that it kind of brings context to this idea. And I think Jim had started to speak about this, is that we have systems, and how do these values impact our systems? And then how do these systems impact how we operate? And I think that there's an example there. And I don't think it's as simplistic as Peterson made it out to be in the video. I think it's a lot more complex. I believe we live in a mixed system, and I think there's all kinds of calculations and things that have to go into that. However, the example, the analogy of it, I felt to be, excellent, because I think that that can be used the same thing when we're talking about belief systems. And so, and how these belief systems evolve. And ultimately, we're talking about how systems evolve. So I think that that's really what my major takeaway is. That was a concrete example of how that it this theory, works within the framework of within a real example. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Next up, I lost track here. Dave, Marco, and Cotton. Dave.
Thanks, Shrikant. Great evening. To me, it's so fascinating to see how we got to where we are right now. And Roger, you really traced it well. As a member of Veterans for Peace, I agree with the definition of Mars that violence and war are seductive, they're tempting, and that my hope is that we can become whole, healthy people and learn to get along without the war and the violence, but make it a better world. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good evening.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Marco and Cotton.
Yeah, it was a great presentation, and my takeaways from the breakout, and basically like the practical usage, that you're sort of like coming from a possession of a guy's ideals and values, and you're sort of like cutting the strings of being a puppet of that possession and sort of becoming those ideals and values.
Thank you, Marco. Next up is Cotton and Jeff.
Hi, my comment is more general, but thank you for the presenters, Roger, Victor, Claire. Just halfway through the presentation, I was just in awe of this this forum, this meetup in particular, and how well organized it is and run. Shikran, you run a pretty tight ship, and which makes everything purr along, and everyone, so many people asking thoughtful questions, and then all the enlightenment we receive in the responses, along with in the chat. George is giving insights into Jung's perspective to the breakout room, which was especially thought-provoking and stimulating conversation. Thank you, Jim Benton, Aaron, John Piero, and all the rest. So I just want to say bravo, bravo, bravi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cotton. And bravo to everybody like yourself who is here, because this is, it just attracts this quality of people and quality of dialogue and the kind of thoughtfulness and openness and putting out all kinds of viewpoints, and of course presenters every day they do such an amazing job, and so absolutely, so thank you very much, really appreciate that. Next up is Jeff. Jeff, are you there?
Thank you, Shrikant. Yes. So we had a rather spirited debate in our breakout room regarding various perspectives, and Shrikant, I saw a relationship between what we were talking about in our breakout group and your final comment there regarding kind of the stability of being able to look back and, in a sense, learn the right things or learn the best things from experience, as well as at the same time needing to be able to adapt to opportunities and threats in the present so that they help to lead us in the long run into a desirable and attractive future. And I think that that there's a bit of magic as well as maturity in considering things in these three, I'm not even sure what the right word is, but sort of three spheres or three dimensions. I think that we're often trying to do that, whether we're trying to assess what reality, We're trying to imagine what kind of approaches might make sense. And then we're trying to apply a certain amount of intuition as well as reason in order to decide what to do. We're trying to figure out as a solitary entity what makes sense to us and what we should do. We're trying to do it in relationship with others. And in the end, we're trying to figure out a way that works both for us as individuals and for all of us together in trying to keep moving forward. I think that there's a problem when we get caught or locked in any one of those dimensions and don't see the richness and really the necessity of considering things in those, at least in 3 different dimensions on almost every question.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Next up is Victor, Claire, and Roger. Victor, what are your takeaways?
Well, tonight was amazing. And I should say, I watched the video a couple of times and I knew the topic itself is quite a tall order. So I actually liked how Roger opened. So he said to empty our definition of God. So which actually is a very good way to dive into the topic. And then Claire brought in the idea of the motivations and the psychological things that play into it. So going deep into the idea of God and cleansing out the definition and going back into our ancestors and seeing what they meant God, what their definition of God is. So it was amazing to listen to you guys.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you very much for your myths. I think they're adding significant value to this presentation. So it's going very well. Thank you. Next up is Claire. Claire.
And some aesthetic value, which I always love. Beautiful. Yeah, I will just echo Roger. I mean, you are outdone yourself this week. And I think especially with a topic that is like the crux of human history and really, brings us up to a foundation and an understanding of ourselves and our motivations. And I mean, I think just walking away with thinking of, in a moment where I feel overcome by some feeling or thought kind of coming across my consciousness in a meditation or whatever that is, thinking that as a God in a way and kind of having a conversation with that, I think is just so powerful. So thank you. I think one thing I'm really kind of struggling with and stuck on is sort of the unsatisfactory element of just sort of being Horus, but never fixing Osiris and just having to sort of live by example and, integrate that in your own self and move forward, but how sort of tragic and unsatisfactory it is that you don't get to actually sort of fix the system or go back and actually patch that up. But I think that's just kind of the way it works.
Excellent observation. Thank you, Claire. Next up is Roger. Roger, what would you like to say?
Thank you for all the love. Oh my God, I don't even know how to take compliments this well. So, but no, I the more good feedback I get, I always just makes me want to do more because I want to. I don't know. I want to clarify things and I want to make things that for me I find really interesting. So I'm just so thankful to everyone that's here for giving me a space where I can talk about this stuff with other people that are also interested in it, and not being like a lot of other people that I stop in the street where they just look at me like I'm a crazy person. So thank you for giving me allocation of that. I did want to answer or respond to David's question about what do you do with someone who values the non-perfect? And I would just say, well, good news. That's more than likely what you're going to encounter for all your life, right? Like the perfection it's not so much that the goal is itself to be perfect, but rather that an ideal, and George pointed correctly, that the ideal is more one of wholeness, one of being able to find that. But perfect more in the sense of what I was meaning was just in the correct solution or a correct solution. but George is right in pointing out that I should really be careful with using that word, because the implication then means that there's only one perfect ideal that everything fits in, where it's much more Jung conceptualized it as a matter of wholeness, of integrating all the different things into one thing. But yeah, no, thank you guys. I'm blown away by how much positive feedback I've received tonight. So thank you. I hope I can keep delivering as well as I think you guys think I did today. So.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much, Roger. Take care. See ya. Bye, everybody. Good night.